All right. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, or good evening, depending upon where you're at. This is Jason Straight with the Cloud Virtual Chapter. Today we've got Carlos Chacon. Okay, good. I got that right. Here with us today, he's going to be doing going over some disaster recovery options with Azure. Carlos is a managing partner with SQL Data Partners LLC and hosts the SQL Data Partners Podcast. Before I turn things over to Carlos, I got a few things I want to cover with the user group itself. If you've been to other user group meetings, this is all going to be old hat for you, but I just want to go through the schedule real quick. So over the next few weeks, we've got sessions coming up on most Wednesdays at 12 Central US. We don't have a session at the moment scheduled for next week, but after that, we've got sessions the following Wednesdays. If you are looking to get onto the schedule, please just reach out to myself or CloudVC at SQLpass.org, and we can get you onto the schedule. Most of the remainder of the year is actually booked up. I got a few sessions where I just don't have abstracts yet that will be filling in the rest of the schedule. And so we are looking pretty good, but I am starting to look at scheduling out for the first quarter of next year. From the PASS perspective, this virtual chapter is a member of the PASS organization, and so here's a few things that are probably important to know about the PASS organization. PASS has the PASS Summit coming up here in October. The PASS Summit is the premier data and data platform conference that's got 200 plus technical experts, or 200 plus technical sessions. Hopefully more than 200 experts. It's thousands of attendees. I think last year or the year before it was about 5,500 attendees that were there. So lots and lots of people that are doing the same kind of work that you're doing. A great opportunity to reach out and connect with somebody that probably has been in the same situation that you're in right now, or is going to be or has been in the situation that you'll get to in the future. Great opportunity to network with those people and find out how you can solve your problems through your own network. If you haven't registered yet, you can get a discount on registration through our virtual chapter. There is the discount code VC15CHB6 that'll get you $150 off your registration. As I mentioned, this is a virtual chapter for PASS. PASS has a large number of other virtual chapters, everything from PowerShell to Excel to virtual chapters that focus on specific languages such as Hebrew. If you are looking for something that in the past, if you are looking for some information regarding any of these areas, you can look in the histories for some of these virtual chapters and find webcasts that have already been completed or maybe are coming up in the future that can help you learn the kinds of things that you're looking to learn. Along with virtual chapters, PASS does promote and help sponsor SQL Saturdays. SQL Saturdays are a Saturday-focused free training event where typically all you have to commit into it is your time and a little bit of cash for lunch. These SQL Saturdays happen all over the world, US, Canada, Asia Pacific, Latin America. They are put on by the community, and so if you are looking for a SQL Saturday in your area, you can generally find one at SQLSaturday.com, or if you're interested in putting one on and helping to network with the community and helping your peers learn, you can also find out information about that at SQLSaturday.com. Volunteering is basically what helps make PASS itself, and so if you are looking to volunteer within the organization, you can go to volunteer.sqlpass.org to find out some of the opportunities to give back to the data platform community. And with that, it is time to hand things over to Carlos for disaster recovery options with Azure. So let me make you presenter, Carlos. One moment here.
Awesome.
All right, you are now presenter. If there are any questions that come up through, I'll look for good opportunities and timings to pass this over to you.
Okie dokie. So let's see. It says that I'm sharing my screen now. Are
Yep,
you guys seeing the slide deck?
I can see it.
Okay, very good. Well, hello everyone. Thanks, and thanks Jason to the virtual chapter for allowing me to come and be with you guys today. These webinars are always a bit interesting, and so I hope we can kind of get through this together. One thing that I am interested in getting from you is a little bit of feedback on some of the things that you are hoping to see out of this session. So this continues to evolve, right? Azure, all the list of services that Microsoft continues to put out just continues to grow and evolve, and the things that you're able to do continues to change. And so one of the things I'm interested in is just getting some feedback on kind of your expectations, right, for the session. And so if you are, you feel confident enough to go ahead and start putting those into the chat window, I think I can, see those, maybe, after or as we're ending up. Or if not, particularly in the feedback, that is something that I'd be looking to get back from everybody. So Jason introduced me a bit. So as he said, I'm Carlos Chacon. I actually hail from Richmond, Virginia. I am the host, along with Steve Stedman, on the West Coast. We host the SQL Data Partners Podcast, which is dedicated to SQL Server-related topics. Today, we release every Wednesday, and today's session was on Cortana, the Cortana Intelligence Suite. We had Melissa Coates on, and we were talking with her about that. So I think I'm doing this from home, as you can tell. Hopefully, my kids will respect the red sign on the door. But if they don't, then maybe you'll get to meet them too. So when we start talking about Azure, and particularly options or features that we have, and I know particularly in the technology space, we like to see a lot of demos. And so I actually have opted not to do any demos in this session. And I'd be interested in getting some thoughts on what I would have liked to have seen these things. What I'm trying to do here is to put together some pieces, talk through some ideas and some concepts, and then, because things change so frequently and whatnot, just to have a good experience with, things not breaking and waiting on, okay, well, where did this menu go, things like that. That's the way I've opted to go with this. That's not for everybody. I always get feedback, hey, I'd like to see some demos. What I'd like to hear, or what I'd like to understand better is, I'd like to see how to do X. Some of the things that we are going to talk about are just a little bit prohibitive as well, and so setting that up and having that available always for demo purposes can be difficult. So there's that. So I guess I do want to help set some expectations as well as to mostly what we're going to be focusing on. So ultimately, the idea here is we have an on-premise SQL Server, and then we're looking to use Microsoft Azure as a disaster recovery location, or as that co-location. The purpose of this presentation isn't so much to talk about, okay, now I'm in Azure, what are my DR options in Azure? I mean, we kind of fly by that. We wave to it on the highway. We don't really spend any time. We don't dig into that. And so that is the expectation. Ultimately, what we're focused most around is the idea of the infrastructure as a service. And so again, it wouldn't surprise me that potentially even next week at the Ignite conference, so unfortunately I'm not going to be able to make it to the summit, and there may be some announcements there, but even I know next week at the Ignite we're expecting Windows 2016 and some other things. It wouldn't surprise me that they start announcing additional services being available. But currently, you can't DR over to Azure SQL Database. for example. And there'd be some manual steps there, I guess, if you were thinking about that. But there's not necessarily, that's not a common thought as of yet. So ultimately, what we're attacking is I'm going to go to a VM that's running SQL Server that's up in Azure, and that's the concept for most of the scenarios that we talk about today. So one of the things that we need to start looking at or start defining as we talk about our disaster recovery options is our recovery time objective and our recovery point objective. These two components help dictate what services or features we would be willing or we can use and at what price point we're willing to pay for these needs. So let's go ahead and define these quickly as we get into that. And so I guess I'm going to, so Vegas, think to yourself, because our interactions are limited, unfortunately, at this point. But think about what does the recovery time objective mean? What does recovery point objective mean? So when I think of these two, so there's a time element, and then there is the amount of data loss that I am looking at, right? So I have my disaster event. My RTO is the amount of time that I can be back up servicing my clients after the disaster has occurred, right? My recovery point objective, my RPO, is the amount of data that I would potentially have lost, particularly when we're talking about SQL Server, right? And transactions that have to roll back, files that didn't get processed, things of that nature, ETL, jobs that didn't finish, that is no longer available in the system, and then I need to figure out what I'm going to do with them. Okay, so these two things then, and what options I have available to me. So, right, quiz time. As a database administrator, you take a full backup. You should take a full backup of your database each Sunday with the differential on Tuesday and Thursday. You also make transaction log backups every 30 minutes. So in this setup, is this objective helping you meet your RTO or your RPO objectives? Now we're going to make a couple of assumptions here. One, these backups are good, right? They've been tested, they're available for us, things like that, right? When we only look at this side of the equation, we really are talking about our recovery point objective. While we have the backups, there is no strategy to then act after the disaster has occurred necessarily, right? If the SQL Server is no longer available, what do we do, right? So having these backups and kind of looking backwards, if you will, we have a recovery point. We know we can get up to that point, but how quickly will that happen is undefined. Do we use another server? Do we have to install SQL Server again? Those types of things, those questions aren't necessarily solved in this example. So another question. So the database is placed into a clustered server. So is this action helping to meet the RTO or the RPO objectives of the application? So in this scenario, we are looking really at the recovery time objective, right? So what we have a highly available solution. Now again, we're making some assumptions as to what happens in our disaster. So we have a shared data store. So we're assuming that the data is okay, and that it's simply the physical server that's having an issue. Network, what have you. That server is no longer available. Well, I want to recover as quickly as possible, so I swing over to the other server. And so from an RTO perspective, that's what I'm looking for when I'm clustering a server. So again, we keep in mind these two things as we go forward into our disaster recovery planning. So either you or your organizations have purchased SQL Server, and in some cases, it can be a little bit like this car. Now, I personally am not a car guy, right? But the internets tell me that this is for a Lamborghini, kind of an expensive car. And depending on, I guess I've seen some SQL servers that that might rival the cost of this Lamborghini, it would seem. So ultimately, we buy this, right? We want it to do a couple of things. We want it to go from 0 to SQL, from 0 to 60, very, very fast. We expect it to be comfortable, to take corners well. We want it to look good. We want, give us a good impression. Quick tangent. So I was listening to some story about Hertz car rentals, and they actually have where the biggest growth comes from them is in these luxury cars. And so they interviewed somebody who rented one of these Lamborghinis or something for a couple of hours, and he rented it to go shopping, right? So to make himself look good, right? So we want our SQL Server to make us look good too, right? So that's something that we're looking for. Now, of course, with the Lamborghini, things can happen to it. It can have a flat tire. So the car itself is still available, but it's going to function in a capacity lower than its intent. And so for some of these things, even locking and blocking can kind of come into this. We tend to think of these are like of the high availability type solutions. I want something where I can quickly take that tire off, I replace it, and then I'm on my way again. And so we're not necessarily going to be covering the highly available options, although we will talk about availability groups to some extent. But the idea is that we're looking for something a little bit more like this, right? The cup holder might still be available to me, but the server itself is no longer available, and then I have to make a consideration to go to either use something else, or because I'm down, I cannot use this as is. It would take considerable effort to make that happen. So ultimately today we want to be talking about the cloud. Right? This virtual chapter is actually dedicated to the cloud, and I'm sure many of you have quite a bit of experience with that. We listen to Satya, and he tells us $4 billion they're doing in annual revenue in the cloud now. This is a picture of $1 billion supposedly, and you're thinking, yes, this is going to help us get where we need to go, and we'll be straight. But then as you get in there, you notice that you're like, what? I was expecting something a little bit different. And so while a lot of these services are coming out, they are available, we do continue to have to work through some issues. Everything's not quite in place, and depending on the options that we want, we may have to give and take a little bit on what's available to us, or what we're willing to take on, because some of the services that we're expecting are just not available. So as we start talking about Azure and the different components, and again, we're kind of focused on the virtual machine environment. While there is some similarities to some of the other services, this is specific to the virtual machine setup. They have two models. So the current model that's available is the Resource Manager, but the Resource Manager really just came out this year, so it's still new, and there's still quite a bit of services. If you were in Azure before really January of this year, then you were probably in the classic model. So the classic model is a bit more like shopping at Dell. There are a few options, right? Maybe you can choose between a 2.1 and a 2.2 gigahertz CPU or something like that. But once those choices are made, like there's your computer, that's it. The availability for customizations is really just not there. So the newer version, Resource Manager, seeks to separate these parts, right? Somewhat like we have CPU, memory, and disk, and says, okay, well, what areas do I need in the cloud? And so they've broken these up. There are three main areas, again, in the virtual machine area. The first is the storage. And while the storage continues to evolve, for the most part, we're talking about blob storage. This is separate, so we can think of this as something as similar as getting SAN space, right? It's just a place for us to put our files, our backups, our things, but we then can't necessarily do anything with it. When we start thinking about operating systems and CPU being able to interact with a server, that's when we come into this compute column. So the compute is, again, so the memory and the speed, the CPUs that are available to us. And again, as you know, the availability to start small with a single CPU and then decide later that I need to ramp that up and I need 10, 12 CPUs. With a glider, I can ramp that CPU up to then meet my needs based on time and budget and all of those different things. The third component is then the network. So this is things like virtual networks, site-to-site VPNs, things of that nature. So how we can connect and access our virtual machines. Out of the box, we get some default behaviors, but if we want some customizations to that, then we will be interacting with the network layers. So when we talk about getting from on-premise into the cloud, and again, our focus is kind of in the SQL Server space, then we're going to be talking about the first option. And I guess as we go through some of these, we're starting with the lowest cost, and then we're kind of going up to the higher costs. And we'll talk about, I won't give specific numbers because again, they can change, they change frequently. The idea of resources are things that we're going to be using actually in the cloud and how they are different in these different services or models that we're looking to implement. So ultimately, in SQL Server, it was available in 2014 and has been expanded on in 2016. But we have an on-premise SQL Server. We can point our backups directly to Azure, to Blob storage. And so the idea is that we can create an account. In that account, we create the container, and then our individual files that we put up then consist of that blob. Right? Now, in order to get up there, and this is a screenshot from the CTP3 of 2016. We can actually simply use the destination to the backup to the URL, and so it's integrated more fully into the SQL Server Management Studio. But of course, on the T-SQL side, what we need to do is we need to create a credential. I called mine Azure Blob, right, with this identity. So the identity is the name of the container that I'm pointing to, and then the secret is the secret that when you've created that container, Microsoft gives you that key, and it's 50 characters long. I've just truncated this so that it just displays on the screen. I create that identity. Then, after creating that identity and the master key, I can back up the database, very similar T-SQL language or options here. I'm backing up my database AdventureWorks. Instead of to disk, I back up to URL. This is the URL that I'm giving it. So this is my account. I have my container, and then here is the Blob component. And it's telling you to use with this credential Azure Blob, which I created up here, and that's how I would do that. Right? So full backups, log backups, differential backups, all work the same way. So just taking a peek at that URL and how that is set up, we have, again, the first part represents our account. So I specify disaster SQL backup. That is unique. Now, I'm sure if you've been creating things in Azure, you know that sometimes you run into trouble with names, and I think that's becoming better as more environments are coming online, and I think they're doing some additional things behind the scenes to make more names available. But so that's the account, and then the blob.core.windows.net, of course, is for the Microsoft component. I then created a container called disaster recovery, and then in that container, I'm going to be putting up files, or in this case, my backup files or other things that, and that's what I'm specifying here as the actual BAK file. So that's so again, through that, I get to use T-SQL. I get to administrate it. I can do point-in-time recoveries. The big change here is where the backup is now located. Now, interestingly enough, I think, and I guess maybe a word of caution. So the guys at SQL Server Radio, Matan and Guy. So Guy was actually talking about this feature, and he called it a stupid feature, which I thought was interesting. And ultimately, I think it's just one of those that it depends on your environment. Obviously, the larger your database gets, the more you have to be familiar, or you have to recognize that you're now basically going over the internet to retrieve and back up your databases. And so if you have maintenance windows, things of that nature, you just need to make sure that you're going to be able to make those or continue to keep those commitments, because you will see an increase of time as you start putting those backups directly from SQL Server out to the internet. And so different scenarios might call for actually just continuing to back up locally and then moving over to Azure. That's still an option, and then potentially you can then just pull that down using the same concept. You create your credential, and then you can restore from that location. So again, just different options there. But the nice thing about this component is that we're only using blob storage, and that blob storage is very, very inexpensive. And again, things continue to change. They've introduced cold storage, and I'm told they're going to introduce like a freezing cold storage, which is something that, so they are talking about restores from that point could take, or getting files back from that area could take hours, right? So it, lots of compression, lots of different things happening to that, so it's not something that will be available, but the tiers are different. And so normally when we talk about standard blob storage, it's 2 or 3 cents, a gig. So when we talk about a couple of terabytes, we're talking about less than $70 a month. And as we interact with other people, they're like, well, that's basically free. And so it is very, very inexpensive. It gives you the ability to never have to worry about calling up the SAN guys again and saying, hey, need some more storage, things like that. And then we'll talk about, like from a business continuity perspective, where you can go beyond that. Now the second one, I guess I just want to kind of fly by. I think if you're an administrator or if you're responsible for the data, this is really not an option, but it is a service that is out there, and I think we should discuss it. So ultimately, what we're doing here is we're going to give SQL Server the keys to the kingdom and say, SQL Server, here's my credentials to the cloud. You take care of my backups. And then through basically predefined scripts, it is going to do those backups for you. Okay? So they have introduced newer versions of this service that now at least will cover the whole server. So it used to be that system databases weren't included. Now it's available. So the defaults are weekly full backups and then log file backups every 2 hours. You can control the number of backups that get used, or that you can control which backups are included and not. If you're familiar with Ola's scripts, Ola Hollengren's index maintenance scripts, it's very similar to that, right? So in this case, there's actually a store procedure in MSDB, and this is a 2016 feature. And all of a sudden, because I don't recommend it, all of a sudden I can't remember if you can implement that in 2014. So I feel like that's something that I want to take away here. Managed. But again, you execute this store procedure through MSDB. You enable it, tell it the database name, or there's the all option. You give it the container, or the URL rather, where it's supposed to go, and then how long it's supposed to retain it. Now there are some restrictions onto how many days it can be retained, things like that, and then away you go. You can also increase the log limit size or the log backup frequency, but there is only up to a certain point, because basically remember, it's being managed through the stored procedures, and you only have available the options that they've coded for. And so I want to say that you can do your logs as much as once an hour, but not any more frequently than that. And again, so I think, the other thing that I guess I wanted to say here is that there's no point in time restores available. Again, because you've kind of given up control to let the service do this for you. So no point in time restore. So if you were doing backups every, let's just say hour, right, and we failed over right now, then you would have to go over. I mean, you'd have to go to the end of the log that you have. You couldn't do a stop at basically in the middle of that file if that's what you wanted to do. Okay, so again, the idea or the benefit with this is that you get to then take advantage of all that space fairly inexpensively. It's secure, and if you then had to, from a business continuity perspective, decide, okay, well, what do I want to do to move forward, right? Then, again, this is just a screenshot from my portal window. I do new virtual machines, and I Server 2014 Enterprise on Windows Server 2012 R2. Now, this is a little bit dated. I'm certain that they have the 2016 now available now that it's out. So from a version perspective, you're good there. Now again, ultimately you're looking at things like, well, if they don't have the version that I have, or it doesn't come by default, then I'd have to get the VM and install like 2008, for example, and then start my restores. So this is cost effective if you're willing to live with the option that my RTO, so the time it takes from disaster to recovery, is a little bit longer. What we're suggesting, or what we've seen, is a reasonable starting place is about 4 hours. So if that doesn't make you go crazy, then these types of options may be in play, right? So maybe not even for all of your applications, but there may be applications that you're willing to live with that, to say, well, we can go back, pen and paper, or whatever, because the cost reductions are such that this makes sense to us. And so again, so at this point, to this point, we've only used the blob storage. Once we start spinning this up, this VM up, now we're paying for the compute components. So one of the other things, again, we just kind of glanced by this, but one of the other things to consider is that now that we are in Azure, we get to take advantage of the geolocation options that are available. And on the VM side, we see that you will get, when you create that VM, you get 3 copies of the VM. You get 2 in the data center that you have decided to create the VM in, and then you get a 3rd copy that is going to be in the region that you have, of that location you've chosen. So if you're in the US, and I'm not sure that I can speak to the other locations, something else I need to take a peek at, but basically in the US you have East and West, right? So if I create my VMs, like for example, most of mine get created in US East 2, then it's going to choose another location to create it in the East region. We're not going to get into a lot of detail as far as like, okay, now how then I would fail over in that scenario, but again, those are some options that then become available. So the next, again, kind of with the SQL Server focus, is the idea of log shipping. Now, we've gone from just using blob storage to now needing the other 2 components. One being the compute, because now we have a secondary database server. That database server, in this example, we're going to assume is in Azure. It's a VM. It's got to be up. It's got to be running. I'm now paying for that compute processing. So just a quick recap on log shipping. If you're not familiar, I have my database. I'm going to restore that database in a secondary place, and I'm just going to move or copy my log backups from the primary server to the secondary server and restore them there, right? So it's the whole database, so I drop a table, change an index, rebuild an index, all of those things get logged and then pushed over to the other environment. So in order to do that, I need I need the compute. I need a VM that is up and available in the secondary environment. But then I also need a virtual network, or I need a site-to-site VPN. So again, there are some additional costs associated with creating the site-to-site VPN. And so you could, in theory, potentially look at saving some dollars if you wanted to bring that log, the secondary server up, restore it, get that going, take it down, and then, once a week or something or whatever, bring it up, get those logs to restore, assuming that I am keeping the logs available enough, or I'm keeping the logs long enough for them to be available during the downtime of the secondary server. That could save you some money, but again, that's potentially maybe with some PowerShell. You could do a little bit of that, but there is going to be some manual steps involved, or at least quite a bit of work to put that together so that you can get notified to make sure that you are that you're up, right? That the restores are happening, things like that. The next option we have is availability groups. Now this is, again, as we kind of going up the pricing tier, the creme de la creme, if you will, of our DR options, because we are mixing high availability and disaster recovery kind of into one bag. Now I didn't go into mirroring and I suppose that's still an option. Mirroring is going to be deprecated after 2016. 2016 has come out with the option for you to, in standard version, to have a single secondary replica that would function very similar to mirroring in the sense that you can't read from it, use it for reporting, things like that. So the idea behind availability groups is that each instance has its own data store. So it's slightly different from clustering where you had a shared data store. Now each instance has its own data store. But then you also, and it's a bit tricky to see, or to, I guess, get it from this slide, but this, this inner section here, there is a window cluster layer there. And this is where things can get a little bit tricky, at least particularly from the database administrator perspective, in that you're going to need your Windows folks to be able to help you, at least give you the, the credentials and whatnot to create objects in Active Directory to support the Windows failover cluster. It also presents some additional challenges just from an administrative perspective. My experience, and I guess I'd be interested in getting some of your experience out there as well, is I would say, I mean, so majority of the time, 75%, maybe plus, of my experience with high availability groups, the issues that I've had have revolved around the Windows failover cluster and not so much the databases themselves. And so, or the availability group option, or the database being unavailable, things like that, it's been around the availability, the Windows failover cluster. And so that just requires some additional skill sets, or at least a recognition that if there's problems, here's the plan of attack, things like that. One of the things we don't want to be doing is introducing more risk in our disaster recovery plans. And lots of people get stung by the allure of the availability groups, but then maybe don't quite recognize the overhead with that. So I have a client, for example, that now they're going a bit backwards. They actually have 2 VMs in Azure, synchronized in an availability group, and then they have a secondary, or another secondary replica, asynchronous mode, that is on site or in their data center. Now, one of the things that you'll need to take into consideration as you look at this is what that failover is going to look like. So normally, each of the members get a vote in the Windows failover cluster. So now if I'm going to take this node 3, for example, so node 1 and 2, let's say, are on my data center, and then I'm going to have node 3 be remote. Well, traditionally it would get a vote, but now we're over the internet, right? And the internet is going to conk out on us sometimes. There's going to be issues in that those servers talking to each other. Eventually it will happen. Right? Things get busy, right? There's somebody else is trying to break the internet with some photo or whatever, and it just is not available. So one of the things that you'll have to take into consideration, and now they have introduced, and again I believe so it's a Windows function, but you can take away the voting rights of this secondary replica if it is remote. But then that means that you need to have something else to be able to get all the voting that you need. Windows failover clustering requires a majority, right? Over 50%. So 50%, like these two wouldn't cut it. I need a third one. I need 51% or higher. So again, something else to kind of keep in mind, you may be adding something additionally, and you can do that with a network share. There are some straightforward options to do that. But in your planning, there are many more additional steps required for this instance than any of the others that we've talked about. So again, in the with the services that are available to Azure, they've integrated some of those components into SQL Server Management Studio and given us the ability so that now that I have my availability group on premise or wherever that may be, I can actually reach out to the server or create a server in Azure that will serve as that secondary replica. But this doesn't take care of all of the issues that, like we discussed, for example, of taking away the voting rights, things like that. Now, so this is in the all of a sudden I'm blanking. This is in 2016. But you are able, because so Windows Server 2016 hasn't come out yet, so you must be able to do that in SQL Server 2012 R2. This idea of a distributed availability group or an availability group of availability groups. So admittedly, I have seen this in theory only. I haven't had the opportunity to get my hands and try one of these. But the idea being is that this availability group is separate and unique. You don't have to worry about those voting rights. I mean, so in this example, this is I guess a bad image because I only have two options. I would need a third, like some witness or the file share, network share, things like that, in order to get parity there. But then from there, I can then ship over to another availability group where it can have its resources. Now, one of the things that it helps gets around is that scenario where my availability group may become available, or I'm just going to start getting reports if my remote server goes offline because the internet, it just has some trouble. It's not fast enough. The response time is not what's being expected. And you might get alerts, and you go look into your dashboard, and it'll be like, "Hey, offline." Then people start asking questions, and you're like, "Okay, let's." It's okay. We're good. This helps remove some of that. It also, however, removes. Let's say for whatever reason you wanted to have two secondary servers remotely. If they're in, so I have two on-premise, I have two remote. When I do that, and they're in the same availability group, from a traffic perspective, the amount of data that gets sent over, the availability group actually sends it over the wire twice, one for each node, right? What you get with this distributed availability group is that it only goes over once. So I could have 1, 2, 4. I get one copy, and then that availability group takes care of distributing it to the others, right? So that's another. But again, then you're talking about additional servers, right? Additional clusters. These are servers that have to be up. I mean, there is no option to turn these down. So again, one of the caveats here is that this is the creme de la creme, and from a price perspective, it's going to be it's going to be prohibitive for a lot of folks. But it is an option out there, and I guess we should be aware of it. So kind of a little plug. Just earlier, we had SQLDataPartners.com/data availability. Andy Malin, Mariano Covo from Argentina, Steve and myself talked about some of these different options, not so much specific to Azure, but if you're interested in kind of just hearing some different concepts or techniques on these different areas. We also include replication, which I don't get into here in this presentation, and may be worth checking out. So now to this point, we've really been talking about server-specific options. But we all know that in addition to the database, we are going to have applications that without those applications, our database is really only useful to so many people. Well, we may love it and care about its well-being. The average user is going to want that application to make use of the data. And so Azure has, or Microsoft has come out with the Azure Site Recovery option. And so ultimately what this is it is it gives you the ability, you have to create another server. So there's another server and storage that you have to have on site to be able to back up your servers. You can do even things like laptops. The laptops, VMs, the physical servers all come into play here. That is one of the advantages that Azure Site Recovery does have, is that it will help you with the different options. However, I guess there's a caveat there. So currently, at least to my knowledge, and I guess you guys would probably know better, I should have checked again, but Azure's not supporting the local or the desktop versions of Windows, right? So while you can back up your laptops and things, they don't have a real clear plan or explanation of what you do with that. Now that you're in Azure, if your site wasn't available. So something I guess to consider. But the idea being, right, so you will use the System Center virtual machine with space. It starts taking snapshots of your servers, sends them up to Azure, and captures them or saves them as VM environments. It will do the physicals, right? So the physicals become virtual machines, like a P2V type move. So again, this is just another example of this process server. You could have, potentially on how many servers or machines we're talking about backing up, you may need additional support to do that. So you're buying additional hardware at this point to implement Azure Site Recovery. However, so it needs that local process, and then we'll reach out, and then there's an agent on each of the servers that runs and captures that information. Then they have a capacity planner to help you figure out how big that process server and the storage needs to be based on your environment. Right. Now, so they have actually fixed this drawback. So in May actually of this year, so I need to take the slide out. In May of this year, they have introduced support for the resource manager. So prior to May, Azure SQL or Azure Site Recovery would only do classic model. So this screen here, if you're familiar, if you've been using Azure, the older VMs, this is classic, right? This is resource manager. So now that they've figured that out, some of the other things that we've seen is that if you have and admittedly, I guess I need to try on a highly transactional SQL server, but we've even seen highly transactional application servers, and ASR has had an issue in actually getting the snapshot started, like that initial snapshot done. Because of the changes, it always just thinks, oh, it gets confused and it just starts writing over itself. And so there are potentially, depending on what you want to back up, there are other services, out there that will do your virtual machine backups. Azure Site Recovery, however, will do the physicals as well, and I know a lot of them. There are several of the bigger ones that I'm aware of that don't do the physicals as well. So there's a happy medium there, I guess. So again, right, we've looked at, we can utilize different parts of the cloud in consideration from cost-effective perspective, if our RTO and RPO will withstand it, to use different options or different ideas or different processes to be able to be available or set up to fail over into the cloud. With a specific emphasis, obviously, in SQL Server, kind of going into the infrastructure component. So now we've failed over, right? We are in the cloud. What do we do about getting back home? with the exception of the availability groups, you're going to be experiencing additional downtime. The advantage, however, is that you get to decide when that downtime is versus, you have a disaster, nobody schedules those, right? Nobody wants to pick the date when they have to be on call and then the server then becomes unavailable. So in theory, with the availability groups, you could come back locally. Again, there would be some considerations for all the networking and things that you'd have to do in that component. But with the other ones, you take the downtime. It may not be quite as long to get back. Some other considerations, for example, if you're using like Azure Site Recovery, is I've just backed up my physical servers to, and now they're VM snapshots. ASR, I know that we were looking at it. I don't know. I guess I haven't heard. I haven't looked, like from a bare metal restore. Currently not supported, to my knowledge. So you would then, your physical server would now be a VM, and you'd have to account for that in your VM stack, or being able to run that. So those are, again, some additional considerations to think about as as you're coming back to your environment. So okay, that is going to kind of do it for me. If you have any questions, looking at the chat window here, it's been very, very quiet. See, and I guess maybe it was my ugly face with the webcam on. So, Jason, maybe that was a bad idea to turn it on. That's why nobody else uses it.
No, we do actually have a couple of questions here that came through.
Okay.
First was a question: does URL backup process, is it okay to use in production? Will it have an effect on performance?
Yeah, so I think performance, yes, in the sense of time to backup will just increase because you're now sending that over the internet. Lots of variables there as to what that impact might be. Assuming that you don't have Azure site-to-site VPN, just the network speed in general, in your facility will impact that. And so, yeah, use with caution, right? Ultimately, I think as the larger you get, I think this feature was given for smaller organizations. So I'm going to say even 600, so 500 gigs and less, right? Type of environments. I think once you get beyond that, you're going to be, again, unless your RTO allows it, you have to think twice about it, or make sure you just test it and understand what the time actually is for you.
Great. Is the backup encrypted on Azure?
Yeah, so the containers are available only to you, and now they have the option of encrypting the blobs. So if you choose so I guess there's a couple of ways to do that. One, you could encrypt the backup in SQL Server and send it over. Or two, you could encrypt the blob. So that would be, I guess, your encryption options. But you could, in theory, send over a backup that is unencrypted. But again, the security policies are such that only you can get to it. Actually, now that I say that, I was playing around with it this morning, and they do have, they've opened that up a little bit where you can get additional access to the blob. So that is a setting of the container, right? So the container has permissions that will dictate, whether it's encrypted and who has access to it, things like that.
Okay. And how do you handle the self-service users of Power BI, data connections in Excel, etc., in adapting to have data connections they normally use to find where the data is after the normal server is down and their data is somewhere else?
Yeah, so those are So great questions, and again, kind of looking at the application side of it. I mean, I think ultimately when this is where the kind of that RTO comes into effect. If you wanted that to be available and the users were less aware of it, obviously there's some downtime. Then looking at something like adding additional connection options in there would be something that you'd have to do. I would think in that scenario, with reducing the amount of manual interactions, you'd have to have something up and available on a regular basis that then your application, Power BI or whatever it be, could include as a connection option.
Okay. And I thought there was one more in here. Yeah, with the backup to URL syntax, is there the reverse of restore from URL?
There is.
All right. Sweet. And we are actually past the end of our time here today. So I'm going to wrap these up. There's a few comments in there, and I'll just get those over to you, Carlos, to take a look at.
Okay. Well, yeah, so I guess I'll just say if you're interested in connecting with me on Twitter, answer some of those questions. Jason said he'd hand me them over. I'd love to chat with you. And thanks so much for having me.
All right. Thank you, everyone. And thank you again, Carlos. And talk to everyone later.